The dark ships came from nowhere like shadows in space. They were huge and black, and they moved without sound. Captain Giwan stood on the bridge of her ship looking out at them. She had never seen anything so scary in her whole life. The alien ships were 10 times bigger than any human ship, and there were hundreds of them. The Vorthok had been traveling across the galaxy for 300 years. They were the most feared beings in space. Every planet they found became their slave. Every people they met became their servants. They had a simple way of doing things. They would find the strongest fighters on each world and break them in front of everyone else. When people saw their heroes get destroyed, they would give up. Hapajuan watched the enemy ships get closer to Earth. She knew this was the end of everything. The blue planet below them looked so small and helpless. The aliens had weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds. They had armor that bullets could not break. They were faster and stronger than any human. Lieutenant Minho was at his station trying to talk to the aliens. He kept sending messages, but they would not answer. This was part of their plan. The Vorthok liked to make people wait and worry. They wanted humans to think about all the terrible things that might happen. It made people more scared down on Earth. Dr. Heinwu was working in his secret lab under the city of Seoul. He had been studying the aliens for years. Every time humans fought them, they lost, but Hyunwoo always took notes. He collected pieces of their ships and weapons. He wanted to understand how they worked and how they thought. That doctor had found something strange about the Vorthok. They were very strong and very smart, but they always did the same things. They had rules they followed on every planet. First they would wait and let fear grow. Then they would attack the strongest people. Then they would take over. It never changed. Dunwoo looked at his notes again. The aliens had conquered 43 different worlds. The warrior clans of Rigel Prime had lasted 2 weeks. The telepathic people of Centauri Beta had fought for a month. The crystal beings of Vega 7 had held out for 3 months, but they all fell the same way. Their strongest fighters were broken, and the rest gave up. The thing that worried Hanwoo most was how the aliens picked their targets. They always went after the military leaders first, then the political leaders, then anyone who might inspire others to fight. They were very good at finding the people who mattered most. They studied each world carefully before they attacked, but humans were different from the other species. The Vorthok had conquered. Humans had been fighting each other for thousands of years. They knew every trick of war. They had invented ways to break people and ways to stay strong when others tried to break them. They had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions in the underground bunkers beneath major cities. Old enemies were working together. Generals who had fought wars against each other were now sharing secrets. Scientists from different countries were combining their knowledge. The aliens had given humanity something it rarely had: complete unity against a common enemy. General Borum sat in the command center under Washington. She had fought in 5 different wars and lost friends in all of them. Now she was planning something that had never been tried before. She was not trying to win a battle. She was trying to teach the aliens something they had never learned. The Vorthok thought they understood humans. They had watched human wars and seen how quickly armies fell when their leaders died. They had seen how people panicked when their cities were attacked. They thought humans were just like all the other species they had conquered. But they were wrong. Captain Sunho was leading a team of special soldiers in the mountains of Korea. They were not trying to build weapons that could hurt the aliens. They were practicing something much more dangerous. They were learning to think like the Vorthok, to understand their minds and find their weaknesses. The aliens had been in space above Earth for 3 days now, just waiting and letting the fear build. This was their favorite part. They liked to watch their enemies worry about what was coming. They broadcast messages to every human communication system, telling people to surrender and save themselves. Pain, but something was not working the way it usually did. Humans were scared, but they were not breaking. They were still fighting, still planning, still hoping. The Vorthok commanders were starting to feel confused. This was not how things were supposed to go. Dio Soyang was watching the alien broadcasts from her research station. She was a doctor who studied how minds worked, and she could see something the aliens could not see. The humans were not just scared, they were angry. And angry humans were the most dangerous the thing in the galaxy. The Vorthok had made their first big mistake. They had given humans time to prepare. Most species they conquered were peaceful or had simple weapons, but humans had spent their whole history preparing for war against enemies who thought just like they did. They knew how to fight creatures who were smarter and stronger. And the Deep Space Monitoring Station on the far side of the moon, Commander Ji-hoon was watching the alien fleet. He could see they were getting ready to attack. Soon their ships were moving into position around Earth, but he also saw something else. The aliens were being very careful. They were not taking any chances. This told Ji-hoon something important. The Vorthok were not as confident as they wanted everyone to think. They had studied humans and seen something that worried them. Maybe they had learned about human history. Maybe they knew that humans never gave up even when everything seemed hopeless. Sung soldier Dong-hae was in the trenches outside New York. He was only 19 years old, but he had volunteered to fight. He knew he would probably die, but that did not matter. What mattered was that someone had to stand up to the aliens. Someone had to show them that humans would not go quietly. Alien ships were beautiful in a terrible way. They moved like living things flowing through space like water. The humans had nothing that could match them in a straight fight. But human weapons had never been about being the biggest or strongest. Human weapons were about being smarter and more determined. As the 4th day began, the Vorthok finally started to move. Their landing ships separated from the main fleet like seeds falling from a tree. Each one carried 100 alien soldiers. They had done this dance so many times before, on so many worlds. They knew exactly how it would end, but this time would be different. The species that had ruled through fear for 3 centuries was about to meet the species that had learned to turn fear into fuel for fighting back. The aliens thought they were hunting sheep, but they were actually walking into a den of wolves. Wolves that had been waiting their whole evolution for this exact moment. The real war was about to begin. The alien ships came down like metal vultures falling from the sky. They landed in the biggest cities where the most people lived. The Vorthok wanted everyone to see what happened when you fought them. They wanted the whole world to watch their champions. Die Commander Sung Jin stood on the roof of a building in New Tokyo watching the enemy ships land. Each ship was huge and black, and when the doors opened, giant creatures walked out. They were 3 meters tall with thick armor covering their bodies. Their weapons glowed with deadly light. The first human soldiers ran forward to fight them. These were brave men and women who knew they would probably die, but they had to try. The bullets from human guns bounced off the alien armor. Like raindrops, the alien weapons cut through human soldiers like they were made of pepper. Jin watched his people die and felt sick, but he did not look away. This was all part of the plan. The aliens wanted everyone to see how hopeless it was to fight them. They recorded everything and sent it to every television and computer on Earth. They wanted 7 billion people to lose hope at the same time. The alien commander spoke in perfect human language. His voice was deep and scary. He told everyone that this was what happened to those who fought the Vorthok. He said that surrender was the only way to avoid more death. He promised that humans who gave up would be treated well, but something was wrong. The humans were not acting the way they were supposed to act. When other species saw their warriors die, they would cry and beg for mercy, but humans were taking notes. They were studying the aliens like scientists studying insects. Privet Kungsu was hiding in a destroyed building. With his squad, they had watched 20 of their friends get killed, but they were not running away. Instead, they were talking quietly about what they had seen. They noticed that the aliens always shot the same way. They noticed which direction the aliens liked to move. Dia Soyang was in her bunker in Australia watching the battles on dozens of screens. She was a doctor who studied how people think, and she could see what was really happening. The humans were not trying to win these first fights. They were learning. Every human who died taught the others something new about the enemy. One soldier noticed that the aliens moved slower in cold weather. Another saw that they always checked the same corners when entering buildings. A third realized that they had trouble seeing in certain kinds of light. Young Dong Yun was part of a night attack team in the ruins of Berlin. His job was to get as close as possible to the aliens and learn everything he could. Most of his team would die, but the few who survived would bring back information that could save thousands of lives later. The aliens were getting confused. This was not how conquests usually went. Most species would have surrendered by now after seeing their best fighters destroyed. But humans kept coming. They kept attacking even when they had no chance of winning. It did not make sense. Dongyin managed to wound one of the alien warriors with a lucky shot. The creature made a sound that was not quite a scream, but not quite a roar. It was the sound of something that had never been heard before. The alien looked around with what might have been fear in its eyes. This was the moment everything changed. The aliens could be surprised, which meant they could be scared, and if they could be scared, then they were not the unstoppable monsters they pretended to be. They were just very strong creatures who had never met anything stronger. The news spread through the human resistance networks faster than any official communication. The Vorthok could bleed, which meant they could die, and if they could die, then they could be beaten. It would not be easy and many humans would die, but it was possible. Captain Taiyun was leading a team of engineers in the sewers under London. They were not trying to build better weapons. They were trying to understand alien technology. Every piece of equipment the invaders dropped was studied and taken apart. They learned how the aliens thought about war. The Vorthok had very advanced technology, but they used it in simple ways. They relied on being stronger and tougher than their enemies. They had never needed to be clever because they had never fought anyone who could match their strength. But humans were not trying to match their strength. Instead, humans were trying to match their intelligence and then go beyond it. Every failed attack taught them something new about alien tactics. Every destroyed human position revealed more about alien weapons. Every dead human soldier provided information that would help win the war. Dia Kwangman was working with a team of linguists trying to understand alien language. They had recorded hours of alien communications and were starting to see patterns. The aliens had words for conquest and domination, but they had very few words for concepts like adaptation or resilience. This told the humans something important about alien psychology. The Vorthok thought in straight lines. They made plans and followed them. They did not change their tactics even when those tactics stopped working. They were like very intelligent robots that could only do what they were programmed to do. Majid was running special training camps in the mountains of Canada. He was teaching human soldiers to think like aliens and then think beyond what aliens could imagine. His students learned to predict alien movements and then do the opposite of what was expected. The aliens were starting to make mistakes, small ones at first, but mistakes that human observers noticed and recorded. They would attack the same way even when it had failed before. They would leave the same positions unguarded. They followed patterns that humans were beginning to understand after 2 weeks of fighting. The Vorthok commanders held a meeting in their flagship above Earth. They were confused by human behavior. Most species would have surrendered by now. The humans had lost every major battle, but they kept fighting as if they were winning. What the aliens did not understand was that humans measured victory differently than other species. For most creatures, losing meant giving up, but for humans, losing meant learning. Humans had spent their entire history getting stronger through defeat. The alien general in charge of the Earth invasion sent a message to the Vorthok homeworld. He reported that humans were more stubborn than expected, but that victory was still certain. He did not mention his growing unease about human behavior. He did not want to appear weak, but deep inside his armored chest something cold was growing. The general had conquered 12 different worlds, and he had never seen anything like this. Before the humans, every enemy had broken after seeing their champions fall, but humans seemed to get stronger when their people died. Night was falling over the battlefields of Earth, and in the darkness human teams were moving. The aliens had won every battle so far, but they were about to learn that winning battles and winning wars were two very different things. The species that had ruled through fear was about to discover what determination looked like when it was fueled by intelligence instead of emotion. The real fight was just beginning. The 5th week changed everything. The humans stopped trying to fight the aliens in normal battles. Instead, they started doing something that made the Vorthok commanders very uncomfortable. They started hunting them like wild animals. Lieutenant Young had been a tracker before the war. He knew how to follow deer through forests and find bears in mountains. Now he was using those same skills to hunt creatures from another world. The aliens were used to being the hunters, but they had never been hunted before. The first sign that things were different came when alien patrols started coming back to base scared and incomplete. Some soldiers were missing, but there were no bodies. The missing aliens just vanished like smoke. Their weapons and equipment would be found days later, arranged in strange patterns that meant nothing but felt very wrong. The Vorthok were apex predators on their home world. They had never been prey animals. They did not know what it felt like to be watched by hidden enemies. They did not understand the fear that came from knowing something dangerous was following you, but not knowing where it was. Dark Wangman had been studying alien language with his team of scientists. They made an important discovery. The Vorth had no word for stalking in their vocabulary. They had words for hunting and killing, but not for the patient following that predators do when they track prey over long distances, is told to humans. Something very useful about alien psychology. The Vorthok thought of fighting as something quick and violent. They would attack with overwhelming force and win immediately. They had never learned to be patient or sneaky, because they had never needed to bait. Humans decided to teach them what real hunting looked like. Teams of former soldiers started following alien patrols for days without attacking. They would leave small signs that they had been there. A footprint in mud where no human should be. A piece of equipment moved exactly 1 inch. A message written in alien language saying, "We are watching you." Captain Ga led a group of special forces soldiers who were experts at being invisible. They would follow alien patrols and do small things that proved humans had been close. The aliens would find their food supplies tainted with things that tasted bad but were not dangerous. They would discover their sleeping areas had been disturbed while they slept. The psychological effect was terrible for the aliens. Vorthok soldiers, who had never felt fear in their lives, suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders. They started making mistakes, shooting at shadows, abandoning good positions because they thought they heard something in the darkness. The alien commanders did not know how to deal with this problem. They had been trained to fight enemies who would attack directly. They understood siege warfare and fleet battles, but they had no experience with enemies who refused to show themselves, enemies who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Sergeant Min Jae was part of a team that specialized in making aliens paranoid. They would break into alien camps at night and rearrange things in small ways that would be noticed. A weapon pointed in the wrong direction, a helmet moved to a different table, a door left open that should have been closed. The aliens started to realize that humans could get past their security systems whenever they wanted. This was impossible according to everything they knew about human technology, but the evidence was right in front of them. Humans were inside their most secure bases doing things that should not be possible. Private Sungman volunteered for the most dangerous job of all. He let himself be captured so he could study the aliens from inside their prisons. What he learned was that the Vorthok were even more psychologically primitive than anyone had guessed. The aliens had ruled their empire for 300 years, but they had never really been challenged. They had conquered species that were weaker or less organized than they were. They had never fought anyone who could think multiple steps ahead or who understood the power of psychological warfare. Sungman observed that the Vorthok had no concept of resilience. They expected their enemies to break quickly when faced with superior force. They had no backup plans for enemies who adapted and learned. They were like very smart children who had never lost a game. The intelligence that Sungman smuggled out through human collaborators changed everything. The aliens were not invincible monsters. They were successful bullies who had never met anyone who could bully them back. They ruled through fear, because fear was the only tool they knew how to use. Dr. Myung was developing new tactics in her bunker under the ruins of London. She called it anticipatory warfare. The idea was not to hurt the aliens physically, but to hurt them mentally by making them afraid of what might happen next. Her teams started playing elaborate games with alien patrols. They would lead the aliens through complex chases that seemed random but were actually carefully planned. The aliens would think they were hunting humans, but they were really being led exactly where the humans wanted them to go. The psychological pressure built slowly but surely. Alien soldiers would wake up to find their weapons taken apart and put back together wrong in ways that showed humans understood their technology perfectly. Their communications would be hacked, so they heard human voices speaking perfect alien language, telling them personal details about their lives. The aliens started to understand that they were not fighting a normal enemy, they were fighting something that had studied them completely, something that knew their weaknesses better than they knew them themselves. They were fighting creatures who had turned fear into a weapon. The Vorthok had spent centuries learning how to break the will of their enemies. Now they were learning what it felt like to have their own will systematically destroyed by creatures they had thought were primitive. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and they did not like the feeling. By the end of the second month, alien troops were refusing to leave their bases. Some units had stopped following orders completely. The species that had conquered 43 worlds was being defeated by an enemy that rarely even tried to kill them. The aliens were discovering that there were worse things than death. There was the constant fear of being watched, the knowledge that your enemy knew everything about you, the realization that you were completely outmatched by creatures who seemed to read your mind. The humans had learned something important about their enemies. The Vorthok were strong and smart, but they were not wise. They had never learned to cope with failure or adapt to unexpected situations. They were perfect conquerors as long as everything went according to plan, but humans specialized in making sure nothing ever went according to plan. They were the masters of chaos and adaptation. They had spent 50,000 years learning to survive in a universe that was trying to kill them. They had become very good at it. The predators were learning what it meant to be prey. 3 months after the invasion began, the Vorthok Empire was facing something they had never seen before. A conquered planet that was terrorizing its conquerors. The reports coming from Earth was so strange that the alien high command thought their soldiers were lying or going crazy. Major Taeyong had been captured on purpose during the second week of fighting. He was a specialist in psychological warfare, and he had volunteered to be taken prisoner so he could study the aliens from inside their detention centers. What he discovered changed the entire war. The Vorthok were not just physically different from humans, they were mentally simple. Their brains worked like very advanced computers that could only run one program at a time. They were incredibly good at that one program, which was conquest through overwhelming force, but they could not adapt when the program stopped working. Taogun learned that Vorthok society had never evolved beyond the level of apex predators. They had become the strongest creatures on their planet millions of years ago and had stayed that way. They had never needed to develop complex psychology, because nothing had ever challenged them. The intelligence reports that Taeyong smuggled out through human collaborators working in the alien facilities revealed the aliens' greatest weakness. They had no experience with enemies who could think ahead. They had never fought anyone who could plan more than one step into the future. Diarmu had been working on something she called anticipatory warfare in her secret laboratory. Her team had created a complete psychological profile of Vorthok behavior, and they knew exactly which buttons to push to make the aliens afraid. They were not trying to kill them, they were trying to drive them insane. The campaign started small. Alien soldiers would wake up to find their weapons taken apart and rebuilt in ways that were technically correct but felt wrong. The changes showed that humans understood alien technology better than the aliens understood human psychology. Then the humans started hacking alien communication systems to play recordings of human voices speaking perfect Vorthok. The voices would recite personal information about individual alien soldiers, things that should have been impossible for humans to know: family names from the home world, childhood memories, details about secret missions. The psychological impact was devastating. The aliens realized that humans had not just learned their language, they had somehow gained access to their most private records. They were being watched and studied by an enemy that seemed to know everything about them. Captain Suyang led teams that specialized in what she called impossible presence. They would leave evidence of human activity in places that should have been completely secure. Alien commanders would find human footprints in rooms that had been sealed, human writing on walls that had been guarded, human equipment in storage areas that no human should have been able to reach. The message was clear: humans could go anywhere they wanted, any time they wanted. The most secure alien bases were not secure at all. The invaders were completely vulnerable to an enemy that moved like ghosts and struck like lightning. The aliens started to understand that they were not fighting a conventional war. They were being hunted by creatures who had spent their entire evolutionary history learning to survive against impossible odds. Humans had been prey animals for most of their existence, and they had become very good at turning the tables on their redditors. Sergeant Ginwan was part of a team that played elaborate mind games with alien patrols. They would lead groups of alien soldiers through complex mazes of abandoned buildings, always staying just out of sight but leaving enough evidence to prove they were there. The aliens would think they were hunting humans, but they were really being herded like cattle. The psychological warfare escalated systematically. Human teams would intercept alien supply convoys, not to steal supplies but to replace them with identical items that had been tampered with in subtle ways. food that tasted slightly wrong, water that had been treated with harmless chemicals that made it smell bad, equipment that worked perfectly but felt different. The aliens could not understand what was happening to them. They were being defeated by an enemy that rarely tried to hurt them physically. Instead, the humans seemed to be attacking their minds, their confidence, their sense of safety. They were being broken down piece by creatures they had dismissed as primitive. Colonel In-Wu had been studying alien psychology for decades, and he understood what was happening. The Vorthok had spent 3 centuries as apex predators, but they had never learned to be resilient. They had never needed to recover from failure because they had never failed. Now they were experiencing failure for the first time in their species' history, and they had no idea how to cope with it. Their entire identity was built on being unstoppable, but humans were proving that they could be stopped. They could be outsmarted and outfought by creatures they had thought were inferior. The breaking point came when human teams started appearing on other worlds in the Vorthok Empire. Somehow humans had learned to use alien transportation technology, and they were spreading their psychological warfare techniques to other conquered species. The rebellion was becoming contagious, and Rigel Prime, the warrior clans who had been broken by the Vorthok 3 years earlier, suddenly started fighting again. But this time they were using human tactics. They were stalking alien patrols, leaving psychological traps, refusing to fight fair. The planet that had surrendered completely was now a nightmare for its occupiers. The same thing was happening on Centauri Beta and Vega 7, and a dozen other worlds. Conquered species were learning from human example that the Vorthok could be beaten not through superior firepower but through superior thinking. The empire that had been built on fear was crumbling because its subjects were no longer afraid. The Vorthok High Command tried to reinforce their garrison on Earth, but the humans had anticipated this move. They had hacked the alien communication networks, and they knew about the reinforcements before they arrived. The new alien troops found themselves walking into traps that had been prepared months in advance. The humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had turned psychological warfare into a science. They could predict alien behavior with mathematical precision and counter it before the aliens even knew what they were going to do. The species that had ruled through terror for 300 years was learning what terror really meant when it was applied by experts who understood every aspect of fear and how to use it as a weapon. The tables had turned completely. The predators had become the prey, and the prey had become something much more dangerous than predators. They had become teachers, and they were teaching the galaxy that the age of the Vorthok was over. The end came not with explosions or battles, but with a simple message. On the morning of the 4th month, the Vorthok High Command received a transmission on their most secret communication channel. The message was in perfect High Vorthok, the formal language that only their elite commanders were supposed to know. The message contained detailed information about Vorthok military positions throughout the entire galaxy, locations of secret bases, identities of undercover agents, plans for future operations. Everything the aliens thought was hidden from human eyes had been discovered, catalogued, and understood. The message was short and direct. We know where you are. We know how you think. We know what you fear. You ruled through terror, but you never understood what terror truly means. Now you do leave our world or learn what it means to be hunted by creatures who have spent 50,000 years perfecting the art of war. Admiral Wanchik read the message 3 times before he understood what it meant. The humans had not just learned to fight the Vorthok, they had learned to think like them and then had evolved beyond them. The species that had conquered 43 worlds was being outmaneuvered by creatures they had dismissed as primitive animals. That psychological warfare had achieved something that conventional weapons never could. It had broken the Vorthok confidence in their own superiority. Reports from Earth described alien soldiers who refused to leave their bases, commanders who could not make decisions, entire military units that had simply abandoned their positions and retreated to their ships. But the humans were not finished. Dr. Jinhuan had been studying Vorthok technology since the invasion began, and his team had made a breakthrough that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. They had learned to reverse engineer not just alien weapons and ships, but their entire communication network. Every Vorthok vessel in space was now potentially vulnerable to human infiltration. The aliens who had ruled through information control were discovering that humans could access their information better than they could. The hunters had become completely transparent to their former prey. The final phase of the human campaign was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to destroy the Vorthok Empire through military force, the humans began to systematically undermine it through information warfare. They spread carefully designed disinformation through alien communication networks. False orders were sent to Vorthok commanders telling them to attack each other. Fake intelligence reports described rebellions that did not exist. Security codes were changed without authorization, leaving alien units unable to communicate with their superiors. Supply shipments were redirected to wrong destinations. The Vorthok Empire, which had been built on the foundation of fear and maintained through perfect organization, began to collapse from within. The aliens discovered that their greatest strength had become their greatest weakness. Their rigid hierarchy made them vulnerable to anyone who could manipulate information flow. Captain Ji-Wan stood on the bridge of what had once been a dreadnought but was now under human control. The ship had been captured not through battle but through a combination of psychological pressure and technical infiltration. The alien crew had simply abandoned it when they could no longer trust their own systems. She opened a communication channel to the Vorthok High Command and delivered the final message from humanity. You came to Earth, expecting to find another species to break and rule. Instead, you found the species that had already learned to break itself and rebuild stronger. You ruled through fear, but we are the children of fear. We are what comes after terror. We have spent our entire history learning to survive against enemies who were stronger, faster, and smarter than us. We learned to turn our weaknesses into strengths and our defeats into victories. You thought you understood war because you had conquered many worlds, but you only understood conquest. We understand war. War is not about being stronger. War is about being smarter, more adaptable, more determined to survive than your enemy. War is about never giving up, no matter how hopeless things seem. We are what you made us, and we are what you could never become. We are the apex predators of psychology, the masters of adaptation, the species that learned to weaponize its own trauma. You taught us that the universe is full of creatures who want to hurt us. Now we will teach the universe what happens when it tries. The Vorthok withdrew from Earth not because they had been defeated in battle, but because they had encountered something there 3 centuries of conquest had never prepared them for. They had met a species that had learned to transform terror into strength, fear into fuel, and trauma into wisdom. The withdrawal was not just from Earth but from dozens of worlds throughout the galaxy. The Vorthok Empire began to crumble as species after species learned human techniques of psychological warfare. The aliens who had ruled through fear discovered that fear was a two-edged sword. Reports came from across the galaxy of Vorthok forces retreating, abandoning positions, surrendering without fighting. The species that had been unstoppable for 300 years had been stopped by creatures who understood that the mind was the ultimate battlefield. The humans did not pursue the retreating aliens. They had made their point. The galaxy now knew that the Vorthok could be beaten, that the age of conquest through terror was over. Species throughout the galaxy began to communicate with each other, sharing information about human tactics. Within a year, the Vorthok Empire had collapsed completely. The aliens retreated to their home system and sealed their borders. They never tried to conquer another world. The species that had ruled through fear had learned what it meant to be afraid, or it became the center of a new kind of alliance, not built on conquest but on mutual defense against those who would use terror as a weapon. The humans shared their knowledge freely, teaching other species how to defend themselves against psychological warfare. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. The strongest creatures are not always the winners. The smartest creatures are not always the survivors. The winners are the ones who can adapt, who can learn, who can turn their greatest weaknesses into their greatest strengths. Humanity had shown the galaxy that there was something more powerful than fear. There was determination more dangerous than strength. There was intelligence more valuable than weapons. There was the ability to never give up. The species that had ruled through fear had been conquered by the species that had learned to rule through hope, through the knowledge that no matter how dark things got, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed, there was always a way to fight back, always a way to survive, always a way to win. The age of the Vorthok was over. The age of humanity had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.